Rio Conventions. I'm Marie-Stéphania Perrine. I'm currently a fellow at the UNFCCC Capacity Building Subdivision, and I'll be your moderator for this session. So the webinar series is part of a joint capacity building program by the Three Rio Conventions. Some brief information about the joint capacity building program by the Rio Conventions. So why the value of synergies is always mentioned and recognized. Little has been done to operationalize them and to yield concrete results. So some years ago, the Joint Liaison Group established by the Secretariat of the Three Rio Conventions with the aim of collecting and sharing information and coordinating the work of the Secretariat, agreed to the development of the Rio Convention Joint Capacity Building Program, which aims to strengthen the capacities of national and local policymakers and practitioners to integrate and foster synergies, coordination, and coherence in the implementation of the Three Rio Conventions and the Sustainable Development Goals. And the program started its full implementation this year, and is being managed jointly by a core team of colleagues from different divisions in the three secretariats. And the Joint Capacity Building Program, it aims to strengthen the capacities of relevant national institutions and policymakers. It also aims to establish a mutual learning experience among policymakers and national institutions involved in the design and implementation of policies, as well as practitioners supporting programs and projects at local level. The webinar series on how to build synergies among various conventions is one of the many activities under the program. So last month, we had our first session, which was entitled Integrated Planning of National Strategies and Policies under the Rio Conventions. During that session, we had a presentation on leveraging Rio synergies, key findings from Rwanda presented by Walter Ederer, a representative of the Economics of Land Degradation Initiative hosted by GIZ. We also learned about the interlinkages between the Rio Conventions and how to build synergies in planning processes during a session presented by Pehan and Ludwig from Rio Impact. So today, our second session will focus on assessing and mobilizing finance for synergistic projects. A few housekeeping rules before we start. So to avoid any disruption and background noises, kindly ensure that your microphone is muted unless you are given the floor by the moderator to make an intervention. And recording of today's session, as well as presentations, will be uploaded on our event page. The link will be posted in the chat. And also at the end, we will send out a survey for your feedback. Lastly, please note that by participating in this event, you consent to it being recorded. So now let's move to our agenda for today. We will start with the welcoming remarks, which will be provided by Eri Tamale. And then we're going to have a work lab session, followed by a presentation from Rio Impact. Then we will have a question and answer and open discussion. And then we will end up with a wrap-up quiz, also by Rio Impact. Some information about our speakers. So first of all, we will welcome Mr. Eri Tamale, who is the Senior Program Management Officer and Head of the Capacity Building and Knowledge Management Unit at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We will also have Dr. Ludwig Liagre, who is a Development Cooperation Professional, Founder and Managing Director of Rio Impact, a consultancy firm specialized on policy and finance for biodiversity, land, and climate. We will also have Pehan Yang, who is working with Ludwig at Rio Impact. Pehan has a master's degree in environmental policy with a focus on synergies between the three Rio Conventions. We will also have with us Dr. Fahim Faisal, who holds a PhD in finance. He is an experienced climate finance specialist with a robust background in business planning and financial modeling. Before we delve deeper into our conversation today, I would like to invite Mr. Eri for his opening remarks. Eri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefania, and Good time of the day to all of you, and we would like to, on behalf of the three secretariats of the Three Rio Conventions, to welcome you to this second webinar under the Rio Conventions Joint Capacity Building Program, and on this topic of accessing and mobilizing finance for synergetic projects. Well, as Stefania has just mentioned, this program is aimed at strengthening the synergies between the Three Rio Conventions. I think going back many years ago in 1992, when the Rio Conventions were adopted around the same time, efforts have been made to promote synergies between the three sister conventions. But of course, we've had some successes, mostly at the global level, but also we've been struggling to make synergies realized at the national level where implementation takes place. And we've been struggling to get something concrete that can help us to realize these synergies on the ground. And this program aims at doing exactly that. And the topic that we are discussing today is at the center of all this. We need the resources to be able to implement many of the programs that combine, join our collective objectives under the Regional Agenda 21, but are now with the Sustainable Development Agenda. And we are happy to be joining hands with the three conventions to make this a reality on the ground. And your participation in this meeting, in this webinar is very important as we think about how can we make this practical. And that's the key message I want to leave you in my opening remarks. How can we make it practical on the ground? How can we jointly assess and mobilize resources for joint of synergetic projects? As Stefania has mentioned, the program is looking at strengthening capacities, not only just at the individual level, but also at the institutional and at the systemic level. So we want to make sure that we have the institutions working on the objectives-related project objectives of the Three Rio Conventions, coming together and having strengthened institutions that can allow us to work together in the long term. As you know, individuals come and individuals go, but the institutions remain. So for us to have real sustainable joint synergetic actions, we need to strengthen the institutions. And as we talk about resource mobilization today, let's think beyond the individual capacities and the skills that we need, but also think about what do we need to put in place at the institutional level that can allow us to mobilize the resources jointly. And this program is also looking at many other objectives in terms of also tracking, monitoring and reporting of progress on implementation of these the Three Rio Conventions. So, or as we are thinking about resource mobilization, let's think about in the context of the broader objectives of the three of these Three Rio Conventions, and also looking at aspects of gender, for example, and also looking at the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in supporting synergetic implementation. So today, of course, the topic is resource mobilization, but let's think resource mobilization to support what? To support all these objectives of this noble joint program. I would like to wish you successful deliberations, and thank you again, partners we are working with, and those of you that have joined today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eri, for your opening remarks. Now I would like to invite Pehan, who is going to do a warm-up interaction through WooClub. So please participate in this very interactive session, which promises to be very fruitful in terms of information gathering. Pehan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefania. Thank you, Eri, for giving the opening remarks. So now I'd like to invite everyone in this meeting room to scan this QR code or go to the wooclap.com to enter this code so that you can participate this interactive action. I'll give the floor. I'll wait for a while so that everyone can have time to join, and then I'll switch the screen so that we can all see the outcomes of everybody's participation and contributions to this interactive session. So I can see that already there are 9 people joining in this WooClap. So let's give another few minutes so that everybody can join in. Okay, now I'm switching the screen to the WooClap. And for those who didn't have time to switch the QR codes on our slides, you can still use this one to join. And we can see that there are 17 people in there here already. So without further ado, let's start this interactive session by inviting you to answer these 2 questions that we provided for you. First, as we would like to hear about your opinions, what comes to your mind when you hear synergies across the 3 Rio Conventions? And don't worry, you are not answering this your answers to nowhere. In fact, all your contributions, yep, it will be shown on the screen in the form of word cloud. Benefits, combined aims, time saving. That's a new word. I love it. Collaboration, better results, effective resource management, exactly. And also coherence, strength, efficiency, essential. All great words. In fact, this is interesting because the last time in our previous session of this webinar series, when we posed this question, this very same question to our audience, we also received similar answers. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. In fact, this repetition, or say this similarity, shows that there is a wide consensus of all stakeholders on this topic, synergies across the 3 Rio Conventions. It is exactly about collaboration to maximize our efforts, to maximize the efficiency, and to better manage our resource allocation. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this first question. Now I'd like to move to the second one, which is more related to our topic today. What financing can do, according to you, to boost synergies between the 3 Rio Conventions? What comes to your mind when we put financing and synergies together? Again, your contributions will be shown on the screen for everyone's reference in the form of word cloud. Participation of private sector, of course. Capacity building, love the answer. PPPs, which I believe stands for public-private partnerships. More results, very direct, exactly. So effective actions indeed. Incentives, now we're talking more economically because of course we want to drive all stakeholders to get involved in this to boost the synergies for building for the 3 Rio Conventions. And Jeff, we're also talking about a lot about Jeff in today's webinar, but later Ludwig is going to show you, Ludwig and Fahim are going to show you that there's a lot more beyond Jeff. Now, again, thank you everyone for contributing to these two questions. This word cloud will not be erased. They will be kept on our vocab, and we'll be very happy to keep showing our results during these webinars and to let more people know that this is how everybody is perceiving the synergies between the Three Rio Conventions. Now, thank you again for your contribution and participation. I'm giving the floor back to Stefania. Stefania, please.
Thanks a lot, Peihan, for this session. Now, as we move forward, I would like to invite Ludwig for the next part of our webinar. Ludwig, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Stefania, dear Peihan, dear colleagues. Nice to see you today. I think some of you were already attending our first webinar. So really great that you are with us again or newly with us on this journey, this capacity building journey on synergies between Rio Conventions. Let me share my screen. I hope you will be able to see the slides. Let me know otherwise. So to move ahead on this presentation based on what Peihan's questions already elaborated on, these questions of synergies between Rio Conventions. Today, as you understand, after the first webinar dealing with addressing in particular the topic of integrated planning and action plans, integrated strategies. Now we're going to talk about how to mobilize resources and what financing opportunities are there to support synergistic projects. And why is this topic of financing and synergistic projects is important to be addressed today? Because first, we have to mobilize much more resources if we want to achieve the land's biodiversity and climate targets by 2030. There is this fantastic publication that you may know already, the State of Finance for Nature. Sorry, I lost my slide. So the State of Finance for Nature, which is a publication produced by UNEP, the Global Canopy, and the Economics of Land Degradation. They have assessed the amount of money needed to achieve the targets of the Three Rio Conventions. And of course, we need much more money. If we take today's resources as a baseline, we need to triple the amount by 2030, and we need to multiply by 4 the resources available by 2050. So it's huge, the funding gap that currently exists. If you look also at the key target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, we know that we need to increase by $200 billion per year the amounts, the resources needed to achieve our conservation goals. So that's a really high amount that we need to mobilize. And of course, these efforts will translate into more capacities to support synergistic projects. What is quite interesting, and you may remember from the first webinar, there are quite many entry points that we can use for synergies because there are many topics already relevant for synergies. That includes, for example, REDD+, climate smart agriculture, ecosystem-based adaptation, payments for ecosystem services, forest and landscape restoration, etc. So all topics that will be very relevant when building projects at the synergies between Rio Conventions. And so why is this topic of synergistic projects important? Because it means better value for money. You can have more impacts with less resources. It means also more attractive projects for the private sector. It means that the private sector will be able to get more environmental outcomes in combination also with social outcomes, because let's never forget that our projects also need to deliver on community and social benefits. So the private sector was mentioned as one of the key elements of Synergies and of this topic of why we need more financing. And I totally agree with you. All the mechanisms that we will discuss, ideally, they would also be very critical to support private sector financing. So that comes with blended finance mechanisms, de-risking solutions that will be critical to support private sector investments. So we know the magnitude of the resources that private sector can invest is massive. And if we are able to mobilize private sector investments into synergistic projects, we will be able to solve a lot of the issues. So luckily, there are already some funds that are able to do this. For example, the Green Climate Fund has specific programs like the RED Plus program, has also the ability to support investments and projects in nature-based solutions, in ecosystem-based adaptation. And the Green Climate Fund is bringing de-risking solutions like concessional loans, like guarantees, for example, or first loss equity. And it also provides grants that can be allocated in technical assistance projects. You also have very interesting funds like the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, that already encompasses through its targeted support program the Three Rio Conventions. So it encompasses the topics of the Three Rio Conventions. We're going to see even later a bit more in depth, or the so-called STAR allocation, so the system for transparent allocation of resources, encompasses actually the Three Rio Conventions. Then we've got also the Climate Investment Funds. That is a global fund that can be mobilized directly by multilateral development banks. And the CIFs, the CIFs, the CIFs is already very well positioned to support synergistic projects. In particular, through two programs. One is the Forest Investment Program that will be key, of course, to support the forestry sector at country level, and in particular to support adaptation and mitigation in the forestry sector. And you've got another envelope, the Nature, People and Climate Program. The last fund I wanted to mention today is the Adaptation Fund that seeks to prioritize topics like ecosystem-based adaptation, climate-smart agriculture, disaster risk reduction, among others. So you understand that these can represent also a very interesting tool, financing mechanism to support synergistic projects. So in that constellation, or in those four examples, the GEF and the Adaptation Fund will provide mostly grants, while the GCF and the Climate Investment Funds are able to provide also concessional loans. The fund that is the most innovative in terms of the types of financing instruments that can be provided, it's clearly the GCF that can also provide, as I was mentioning, equity as well as guarantees, which are very conducive to support the private sector. The GEF also has a specific window called non-grants instruments that can help to support, for example, projects with equity or concessional loans, but the percentage of the GEF resources allocated to the non-grants instruments is rather tiny. Just a slide to show you how to present a proposal to the GEF, to the Adaptation Fund, or to the GCF. It's a very simplified view here, and in reality, it's a bit more complex, but for the sake, let's say, of our discussions today, we wanted to simplify a little bit. But the approach is very similar in all cases. A project developer, a project promoter will have to get the so-called approval or non-objection by the fund focal point at country level. The fund focal point at country level is called the designated authority for the adaptation fund, or the national designated authority for the GCF, or the GEF focal point. Once the project concept has received a green light, let's say, by those funds focal points at country level, then the project will have to be developed in the form of a concept note, a full concept note. And usually this step is done together with an accredited entity. That means an entity, an organization that has the capacity to directly mobilize resources from one of these funds. So those entities are called the GEF agencies for the GEF. There are a bit more than 10 GEF agencies these days. These are called the implementing entities for the adaptation fund and the accredited entities for the GCF. So you can choose between national, regional, or multilateral accredited entities. And then together with those entities, you will develop your project and propose it to the secretariats of the funds that then will submit to their boards the project proposals. So that's really a simplified view. Of course, the project cycle is a bit more complex in reality, but that's just to show you that there are many similarities between those funds. And happy to tell you more, of course, in the discussion. Don't hesitate to use the chat and ask any question you would like to discuss today. We are here together for 1 hour and a half, so we have time also for some Q&A and discussions. Just a snapshot, a zoom on the GEF. The GEF, as I was mentioning, is a key tool, a key vehicle to support the synergies between the Rio Conventions, because it supports for its 3 focal area: biodiversity, climate change, and land degradation. And in the so-called star allocation, so the system for transparent allocation of resources, each one of the eligible countries knows at the beginning of each GEF cycle how much money is available for each focal area. So a given country would know how much money is available for biodiversity, how much for land degradation and climate change. And the GEF incentivizes strongly projects that will cover several focal area at the same time. Depending on the cycles, they also have specific programs. For example, in the GEF7 cycle, they were called impact programs, where a country could possibly get a top-up on top of the star allocation for specific projects directions, like, for example, concentrating on restoration, concentrating on sustainable forest management. Every cycle has specific angles and directions. I already talked about the non-grants instruments, but as I was mentioning, this is really a tiny portion of the GEF allocation. Now let's discuss the question of the national and local financing mechanisms that are also very important tools and types of solutions to support synergistic projects. Oftentimes they are, I would say, underestimated, because one tends to look more at the international sources, but those domestic solutions are also very promising. And the first category is around the national funds, national climate funds, national forest funds, national biodiversity funds, also called conservation trust funds. And you can see on the slides a few examples, but there are many more. You've got more than 50 national forest funds existing in the world, more than 60 conservation trust funds existing in the world. So there are plenty of examples, and countries who do not yet dispose of such funds, I think, are very much invited to think of how to set up those mechanisms that can also be then eligible to international funding. We can discuss that topic also. Another, I would say, dimension to consider are those so-called innovative domestic finance options that can encompass a wide diversity of solutions. That includes, for example, green bonds, that includes the earmarking of fees and taxes, and then that can also address innovative solutions like, for example, carbon credit schemes, now biodiversity credits, and more. On the third pillar of this dimension, I would like to emphasize the importance to work also with existing national institutions that for some of them are already accredited to the GCF or accredited to the Adaptation Fund. We'll see one example in a minute. Now, let's do a focus on conservation trust funds. These trust funds are established as legally independent institutions at country level that are there to specifically mobilize the necessary financing to support biodiversity projects, but also to finance the management of protected areas. These funds are very powerful when their governance and capitalization setup is well defined, well in place, and open enough to attract a diversity of donors and funders. Those countries that have set up these kinds of funds have been very successful in funding their protected areas, and the trend we observe is that those funds keep on capitalizing and growing, and the more they capitalize and grow, the more resources they have then to support protected areas management, but also biodiversity conservation. If biodiversity, land and climate topics would be mainstreamed and synergies between conventions would be mainstreamed as part of those mechanisms, conservation trust funds as an example, this could lead to a lot of additional resources for synergies between Rio Conventions. So this topic of the mainstreaming of synergies within the context of these domestic funds and mechanisms can be really an interesting driver for the synergies in complement to the international funding. A case study on one of these national accredited entities, SANBI, which is the South African National Biodiversity Institute. SANBI is already accredited to the Adaptation Fund, to the GCF, and it has already implemented successfully a number of GEF projects. It's a very good example, and there are others, of those national entities who have been very agile, in getting, in mobilizing different types of international funding opportunities, which makes them very resilient and also very agile to develop different types of projects. One of the projects that SANBI has developed with the Adaptation Fund is a microfinancing facility for local climate action, in particular for adapting small farmers to the adverse impacts of climate change in South Africa. And they have developed this fund as a way to build sustainability in the system, to have the possibility to grow also this fund in the future. And so that's really a good example of how you can use Adaptation Fund money to build your own local national facility that will also remain on the long term, because once it's established, you can also expand capitalization beyond the Adaptation Fund. And so that is also a very good example of how to build a so-called paradigm shift approach within a project, because beyond the project termination, the Adaptation Fund project financing, then South Africa disposes of a long-lasting microfinancing facility. That's the philosophy of this type of projects. And that's also very conducive, given the topic that is chosen and the types of stakeholders supported, small farmers, very conducive to build synergies for land, biodiversity, and climate benefits. Another example that I find really interesting as part of the topic of national funds is the Rwanda Green Fund, the so-called FONERWA. The Rwanda Green Fund is a domestic fund under the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Environment of Rwanda that is accredited to the Green Climate Fund. So this domestic fund can directly receive funding from the GCF. And it does it to finance very local projects with a lot of local and communities benefits on top of all the synergies related benefits. That includes, for example, projects for the rehabilitation of soils, for ecosystem restoration, for the development of wood and non-wood forest products value chains. It is a very good example of how you can build synergies thanks to a well-capitalized domestic fund, capitalized through climate finance, but also open to other sources of financing. Now, the Rwanda Green Fund has been capitalizing on different types of resources. They are also now in the process to establish a biodiversity facility that will complement the work they are doing for biodiversity conservation financing. So now maybe let's have a bit of a look at what private finance for synergistic projects mean. And of course, this encompasses very different realities. We won't be able to go into all the details today, but let's have a look to some of the incentives that can help to mainstream synergies for private investments. That may include green taxonomies. Green taxonomies, as you know, can offer guidelines, but also specify criteria and standards to invest in environmentally sustainable projects that can foster synergies. One can think also of some very specific biodiversity and carbon credit schemes that can attract private investments in environmental projects. Carbon finance, you know, is already well proven despite some issues in the last year that are being corrected and improved. But the biodiversity credit schemes are now being piloted in many parts of the world. We can hope this will yield interesting methodologies and approaches, including to attract the private sector. There are very interesting also models of tax breaks, grants, technical assistance that can favor private sector investment in environmentally sustainable projects. Many different models. We could spend really a lot of time. Don't hesitate to write in the chat, you know, examples or projects you are aware of that you'd like to share also with our participants. An example here, I invite you to look at what Iberostar is doing, you know, with their coastal restoration program. They've been investing in research, in establishing nurseries, restoring reefs, mangroves, coastal dunes. Of course, this example is also here to show that when we talk about synergies between Rio Conventions, we're not only talking about sustainable land use, we're also talking about other ecosystems, wetlands, but also coastal areas, oceans. You know, there are many other ecosystems that are to be addressed for the synergies that can benefit from the synergies. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I suggest that now we open the floor for some questions, answer, remarks, comments to elaborate on what was presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ludwig. So as Ludwig mentioned, please, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate, raise your hands. Okay. I see no hands. Don't be shy.
Well, maybe we have an exercise also that could help break the ice, if it helps.
Okay, so if there's no question for now, maybe we should go into the exercise, Ludwig.
Yes, let me share my screen again. Yeah, we wanted to put some of these elements we just discussed into a small exercise, just to get us discuss on this important topic on how to get synergies financed. And so that particular exercise is about making a domestic fund fit for synergies. So as I was mentioning in my presentation, you've got many existing domestic funds, be they national forest funds, national climate funds, conservation trust funds, you know, so sometimes national agricultural funds, rural development funds. There are many domestic financing mechanisms, domestic funds already existing in your respective countries. So how can we try to make this fit for synergies? And so today I'd like to propose an exercise where we could discuss how a national forest fund in a given country could be made fit for synergies. Usually a national forest fund has the mandate to provide financial support for the conservation, management, and enhancement of national forest resources. So it aims really to finance reforestation, afforestation, and sustainable management of forest ecosystems. Usually, the NFFs are hosted under one single ministry. So in our particular case, we propose to have it hosted under the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry of the given country, with a board composed of a MAF representative, so a representative from the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, and from the Ministry of Finance. It's often the case like that, actually. In the case of the fund that we will discuss today, there is only one source of financing, a tax on imported wood in that case. So only one source of financing, so they don't have, as we presented before, some of these international capitalization opportunities, not for the time being. So the objective of the exercise would be to identify measures, activities that will make the funds fit to finance synergistic projects, to deliver on land, climate, and biodiversity benefits. So you would be asked to think for about 3 minutes on what could be those options, those measures. And then please prepare a few messages you would like to share with us, with the participants today. We'll ask a few volunteers maybe to share with us their thoughts. And otherwise, you're also invited to write some messages and ideas directly in the chat. So some of the measures could include, for example, governance adjustments. As you understand there, they have only 2 ministries in the board. Maybe adjustments are needed, and also maybe capitalization changes or the diversification possibly would be needed. On spending modalities also, things could surely be done, to help synergistic projects to be selected, to be financed. So now I would say the floor is yours. Take some time, maybe 3 minutes. We can pause for 3 minutes so you can make your mind on these questions, and then we'll be back to hear from you. Good luck. See you in 3 minutes. Still a few seconds, and then we'll invite you to take the floor. Don't hesitate already to ask any questions, also in the chat or sharing any thoughts about the topic. So I think we'll stop here. Who would like to give us some thoughts on maybe governance or capitalization or spending modalities that should be adapted? Yeah, Amara, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for the floor. So I think that board diversification to include multiple kinds of stakeholders will make the NFF more capable of integrating different kinds of ideas. So when we say different stakeholders, uh, at this point in time, it says that the board governance only represents the finance ministry and the MAF representative. So more diversification there in terms of maybe including the ministry of the law ministry or the or to include gender and youth, even for in terms of diversifying stakeholders, because at the end of the day, your National Forest Fund, it's a huge area that is being covered. So I don't see that huge area being covered in the board governance, and that should be catered to.
Thank you very much. Are there other maybe feedback, comments, remarks related to governance aspects, as Amara rightly pointed out? Don't hesitate to open your mic also and to intervene. Because as you said, Amara, this question of governance is key. And usually what we observe is that an open governance, what's really called, technically speaking, an open governance versus a closed governance. An open governance is always conducive to a better capitalization, because oftentimes with an open governance, you create more transparency. You include within your board a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of stakeholders and sectors that can also help you to better address the topics of synergies. And by having this diversity, private sector, civil society organizations, youth groups, etc., you create also this feeling of ownership of the fund at the national level. Yes, I saw a colleague willing to speak. Please go ahead.
Hello, I'm Raquel, and I'm scientist at Field Gardens, and I think like scientific representation is important, especially for the point of biodiversity assessment and conservation action with all these other groups. And yeah, so if there is a Minister of Environment that is different from the agriculture and forest, it's different in each country, but it could work with the connection with universities or like authorities in conservation.
Thank you very much. And it resonates a lot what you just said with the topic of the joint monitoring and reporting across the Three Rio Conventions. So having scientists on board is also very helpful. And usually what those funds do, they appoint a sort of a technical advisory committee or a scientific and technical committee that will help the board to take the right decisions based on experts and scientists' advice. You can also, of course, have scientists directly within the board. It can also be the case and be very efficient like that. Very good remarks. Maybe give a special focus to cost effectiveness to make sure the NFFA is able to finance multiple projects. Very good points, yeah. And usually the funds management team has to be quite small, because the idea of a fund is to finance projects, not to grow another organization, so the fund management team should be as efficient as possible, also to allocate the resources where they have to go. Apart from wood taxes, are there any other means of building domestic funds? Yes. In fact, the example of the wood tax, the tax on imported wood, is the example of the fund in Morocco. The National Forest Fund has as a main resource this tax on imported woods. But then you will see other national forest funds or conservation funds that build their capitalization on multiple sources. That includes international sources like climate finance. That's why some of these funds are already accredited to the Adaptation Fund or to the Green Climate Fund. But then they will also mobilize other sources of domestic sources. That includes, for example, tax on tourism. That could include tax on water consumption or tax on oil. That's the case of Costa Rica. Costa Rica FONAFIFO, that is the National Forest Fund of Costa Rica, is mostly capitalized through two taxes, a water tariff and a oil tax. So you've got a really wide diversity of ways to capitalize the funds. Oftentimes it has to be also contextualized depending on what contributors are the most relevant to secure enough funding for your fund. But usually a mix of domestic sources and international sources, but also private sources can be very meaningful, knowing that, for example, you have examples where the resources from biodiversity offsets are partly mobilized through domestic funds, for example. So you already have a number of ways of biodiversity credits tomorrow. Carbon revenues are already geared towards some of these funds already. So there are many ways to mobilize resources, and that's where an open governance can also help to trigger that diversity of funding sources. What would be a good impact metrics to measure the extent to which a project creates co-benefits and synergies of financing? Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, we are working on that topic currently, to identify the key elements of joint monitoring and reporting frameworks, which is absolutely critical. And you can see that question as simple or more complex, depending on how many of the existing targets and metrics within the Three Rio Conventions targets and KPIs you want to include as part of your projects. But the integration of those mechanisms will be key for the synergies, and finding ways to make them also very cost effective, because the idea is not to add a layer of complexity, but on the contrary, to find more ways to deliver more cost-effective approaches. Are there any other remarks on the exercise or questions? Thank you, Anna. Otherwise, I'll give back the floor to Stefania.
Thank you, Ludwig, for this insightful presentation and interesting discussion and case studies. So I now give the floor to Fahim for his presentation. Fahim, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Stefania. So I will just share my screen. Just let me know if you can see the screen. Just checking, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Ludwig. Thank you, Stefania. So as previously mentioned in Ludwig's presentation, SOF can be a very good option for us for mobilizing financing for synergistic projects. So in this particular presentation, I will discuss about Green Climate Fund, how Green Climate Fund can also be used for mobilizing financing for synergistic projects. So what we will do, we will discuss regarding one of the project that Green Climate Fund is actually financing. So it's the Ghana Shia Landscape Emission Reduction Project. So GCF actually approved this project in 2020, and currently it's in the implementation phase. So we will discuss regarding some of the activities, how they're actually contributing in, suppose, achieving synergistics through this particular project. So we will be kind of like using this particular project as a case study. And definitely we can learn many insightful ideas. Possibly we can use some of those ideas in future projects. So just to get into the main topic, why synergy is important, why we're kind of like having this discussion about synergistic projects. So if you look into the overall financing requirement, so there is a significant financing gap. So by 2050, we need to suppose mobilize around $8.4 trillion supposed to mobilize these different kinds of project, environment-related project. But at this moment, there is a significant financing gap. So if you look into the annual figure, annually we need to mobilize around 536 billion, but currently it's roughly around 120 billion. So there is a very big gap. So whatever amount of financing we have to suppose properly use that. We have to ensure proper value of money. So in that perspective, synergistic project can be a very good option for us, because in this kind of project, we can actually achieve multiple objectives. We can actually address climate change related issues, land management related issues, and biodiversity related issues. So that's why it's very important to focus on synergistic projects, and that's why it's very important to understand how we can use our scarce financing to actually implement some of the synergistic projects. So now I will straight away move into the Ghana Shia landscape emission reduction project. So as I have mentioned, GCF has already approved these projects, and now we will discuss some of the activities or suppose this project is targeting. So if anyone is from Ghana, you can also share your experience regarding this project. So what they are doing, they're actually targeting degraded land areas, and in those land areas, they're actually planting shea trees. So I will just move back a bit. And this is some of the, suppose, pictures of that particular project. So the trees that you are actually seeing is called shea tree. And from this tree, different kinds of material can be derived. One of the very interesting material is that we can actually derive butter from this tree. And the project actually builds on that particular aspect. Along with butter, medicine, and different other materials can be derived from this tree. So what they are doing, they are actually planting shea trees around in 0.1 million hectares of degraded land area. So they are actually specifically targeting those land areas. And along with shea tree, they are also planting a native tree, around 0.48 million native trees. So they are not actually focusing on a monocrop structure. So instead, they are kind of like planting different kinds of native tree, which is good for the biodiversity related issues. At the same time, that particular region of Ghana has previously lots of wildfire and forest fire related issues. So that's why in this particular project, what they have done, they have introduced specific activities for forest fire management. So in that way, they're trying to preserve whatever work they're actually doing through this project and ensuring that, okay, in future, the area don't have this kind of forest fire, and they can actually ensure that, okay, the biodiversity is properly protected. So frankly, this particular project is addressing land degradation issue. It has strong climate change angle. And at the same time, it's also focusing on biodiversity management and protection. So all three areas of synergistic project are actually covered. In addition, it's also focusing on employment generation for the community members, especially women, because the project believes that, okay, if we can actually generate income for the community members, then the community member will have ownership in this kind of plantation. They will properly take care of all the supposed shea trees. That's why the project has very strong community employment generation angle. So what they are doing, they're suppose organizing different women group, and these women are actually collecting this shea butter, suppose shea nuts from different trees, and then they're kind of like processing those nuts and ultimately suppose preparing shea butter. And globally, the shea butter, if you look into the shea butter markets, it's a very big market, around $2.75 billion market. So that's a massive market. So basically, they are bringing in women entrepreneurs to suppose tap into that particular market. So in that way, they are actually having a very good community angle, suppose community involvement in this particular project, which is very important to ensure sustainability of any synergistic project. At the same time, the project also have a specific output related to RED Plus approach. So it's helping Ghana government to fulfill the workshop framework architecture requirements. So the project also try to suppose look into that particular aspect. So although it's not a very big project, if you look into the total amount of this project, so it's around $54.5 million project. But even through that particular amount, it's creating a very strong impact in the community level. And if we look into the overall financing structure, GCF is providing, suppose, around $30 million grant, $30 million grant. But at the same time, they're also encouraging participation from the government. So the Ghana government is providing around 15 million. So it's a co-financing structure. The Ghana government is providing around 15 million contribution, and the UNDP is the accredited entity for this particular project. So they are bringing in additional amount for this project, and GCF is actually taking grant position in this particular project, and they are kind of like providing around 30 million grants. So since it's an adaptation project, so the GCF grant companies is very strong in this particular project. In terms of project development, if you look into the project pipeline and how this project actually moved forward, definitely, suppose it took around 2 or 3 years, roughly around 3 years. So what we can do possibly, if we can actually reduce this time frame, let's assume streamline the approval process of this kind of synergistic project, that can be very beneficial for the community. So this particular project, the concept note was submitted in 2017. Then the funding proposal was submitted in 2018. Then it took around 2 years just to get GCF's board's approval and secretariat approval. So possibly one of the area that where we can actually work, we can think about the streamlining process of synergistic project. Let's assume we want to bring this kind of project in the front, and how we can actually streamline the project approval process for this kind of project. So possibly that can be one of the areas that we can focus. So currently this particular project is in the implementation phase. UNDP is the accredited entity. They're implementing this project, and possibly after the implementation, there can be additional learning opportunity. And definitely we can actually use that learning opportunity in future project. Maybe there are some issues that we need to improve. So this kind of project can be a very good option for us to actually explore all this learning aspect. So in terms of recommendations, so just very briefly, I will just mention about 2 recommendations. One is in terms of policy approach, how we can actually develop a kind of like synergistic approach in terms of policy level. It can be global level policy, and it can also be national level policy, how we can actually prioritize synergistic projects. So when we have those kind of policy, it becomes relatively easy to get financing, both at the global level and also at the national level. So having that recognition from the policymaker is very important. And at the same time, it's also very important to bring in a strong community participation. Ultimately, what happened after the implementation phase, the community members comes in, and they have a very strong role to play. So their ownership is very important. So whenever we are actually designing this kind of project, it's very important to think about the community members' priority. Possibly in this particular project, what they did, they strongly focused on the livelihood issues of community members. So possibly that can be one of the angle for any future synergistic project. What we can do, we can actually think about the livelihood issues and support other priorities of community members and bring those aspects in the design phase. So possibly that can be very important. In that way, we will be able to make our synergistic project sustainable. So I think, yeah, that's it from my presentation. So basically, our objective was to share one of the project example, how they're actually developing that project, and definitely learn from that particular project. So if you have any queries, definitely we can gladly address those queries. And if you have any comments, especially if you are from Ghana, so we'll definitely like to know about your experience regarding this project and learn more about this project from you.
Thank you very much, Fahim, for showcasing this case study. So if you have any question for Fahim, please don't hesitate. Raise your hands and ask your question. Ludwig?
Actually, yeah, I just wanted to make a complement to what Fahim presented, because this project is a very interesting example of how you can use a mechanism like RED+, for example, to also get some of the resources to incentivize local communities to act for multiple outcomes. And I didn't mention that many of the national funds that we discussed before can be really reinforced also if they use payments for ecosystem services approach, in the sense of providing incentives to local communities, to local stakeholders, to what we call local stewards, to act positively on biodiversity, climate, and land. And by implementing a payments for ecosystem services approach, you also foster a result-based payment approach where you incentivize with monetary or non-monetary incentives local stakeholders for actual results that they help deliver. That's just what I wanted to add. I see Alejandro also wanted to take the floor.
Thank you, Ludwig. Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. Now, I just wanted to make a comment. I mean, we heard two very interesting examples of projects, the Ghana one, and in your case for the exercise, Ludwig, something that was brought to my mind was the issue of trade-offs. Trade-offs in the context of synergistic projects in terms of one main benefit for the project, which could be forest conservation and maybe getting revenues because of, and in the case of Shia, but how could that be detrimental to the other benefits in terms of biodiversity conservation on sustainable land management? I'm not saying that these projects have this effect, but I think something to factor in when you develop the synergistic projects, that it's not one in one benefit sacrificing the other, and those trade-offs need to be analyzed. And that's something that actually in the joint capacity building program we're working on even at the level of our info brief. So just wanted to mention that. I would welcome any comments or reactions to that, but I see someone is asking for the floor. Thank you.
Okay, so we have Remo.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I just want to know why this process to get financing is too long, because when in your presentation, I saw that it's made more than 2 years, 2 or 3 years. Why this process is too long?
Okay, so normally in GCF project, it requires at least 1 year. So in this particular project, it was 3 years. So maybe GCF had some supposed query based on my understanding, because the project was submitted in 2018, it was finally approved in 2020. So based on my understanding, maybe GCF had some issues regarding climate rational. So in most of the project, they're very particular regarding climate rational part. So possibly they had some observation. But UNDP was kind of like the accredited entity for this particular project. So they quickly resolved that. So yeah, the project got approval within 3 years. So based on my experience, in most of the cases, they're very kind of like critical regarding climate rational. Maybe that's one of the reasons regarding this 3-year time period.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Remo. So I also see that we have Raquel.
Okay. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
It's a question like this project. How long was projected to this amount of money was invested for how long? And if there is like a development that is like for like eternity would be good. But...
Okay, so this particular project, the project duration was around 7 years. So it started in 2021. So I think it will finish in 2028, late 2028. Another thing is that they bring in the community members, and through that process, they're kind of like developing an exit strategy. So by bringing in community members in management of this Shia parkland, so they're actually ensuring that it's a sustainable mechanism. And when suppose UNDP exit from this particular project, it continues. So that's the exit mechanism they actually developed for this particular project.
Yeah, and how many people was involved?
Okay. So in terms of direct beneficiary, they actually targeted women beneficiaries as the direct supposed beneficiaries for this project. So approximately 20,000 women participated in that particular project. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Really nice.
Thank you. Ludwig?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring an information around the size of projects, because as you saw from the example that Fahim presented, the GCF project can be really large. And it's easily in the magnitude of several tens of millions and sometimes above 100 million US dollars. The idea is to support projects that have an impact at scale, so that address a large superficie of land, large surface, and also many resilient communities and people. So that's why also you see these large numbers. And oftentimes also those large numbers with the GCF are linked to commercially oriented projects where finance stakeholders play a role, like local banks, for example, or regional banks, or multilateral development bank. And in that case, the sums, the amounts involved are often larger than for grants projects only. That's why oftentimes you will see larger envelope for GCF projects that can mobilize resources through the finance sector and for the private sector, much larger amounts than for funds like the GEF, which usually only allocate grants of a smaller size. Maybe on the question, because we did not reply to the question of Alejandro on trade-offs, I think we need to elaborate some sort of guidance on how to address those trade-offs. So we're working on it. And I hope we can partner with similarly interested organizations on this topic, because we clearly need to put all the motivated brains around the table to address this complex topic of the trade-offs. One also example now that is extremely important is around the topic of green commodities value chain. How can we continue producing food and some of the natural materials we need while still delivering benefits for biodiversity, land, and climate, and for people. So that's an equation that seems very difficult to solve, but we need to put our brains together and find the right models and the right methods also to plan for these kinds of projects.
Thank you, Ludwig, for this comment. I see Ari.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for the two presentations, and Fahim. It's an interesting project, but I want to focus on the point raised by Pehan regarding the whole issue of monocultures and the negative impacts of these. And I want to hear more, maybe in terms of what efforts that are being made to sort of minimize the monoculture approach, and encouraging the communities to think more broadly and how they can diversify the kind of crops, or maintaining the ecosystems around the shared tree plantations. Yeah, so I would like to hear more about that, and yeah, what kind of guidelines we can provide, what more can we do to help the communities? Thank you.
Okay, so for this particular project, what they did during the project design phase, they had kind of like considerable stakeholder consultation, and what they did, they chose some native species based on those consultations. So possibly that's one of the approach that we can follow. And at the same time, what they did, they actually planted lots of native trees along with this shea plantations, around 0.48 million, which is substantial. So they actually had specific budget for planting these native trees. So throughout the project area, they actually planted around 0.48 million native trees to address that particular challenge.
Okay, thank you very much, Fahim. I see that Raquel, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm participating. I was interested to participate in this series of webinars because currently I coordinate the tropical important plant areas in Q, but it's a project in collaboration with important plant areas from Plant Life that organized since 2004. And we had like different areas in the globe, like in South America and in Africa, with project based with communities. And there is a series of criteria that to focus in endangered with threatened species, plant species, and also endemic and useful plants. So Bolivia and other countries decide to have like a approach more in useful plants. And we are trying to understand how we can gain scale and make this like a large long-term program. And I think this point of like trade-offs, like conserving species, looking for like a useful plants, but also like the threatened and endemic that we don't know because we're still like trying to record biodiversity. And that's why like I really thanks for this kind of webinar to understand how we can get funding and how to do the synergy with the three conventions. That's the case.
Thank you very much, Raquel. Ludwig or Fahim, would you like to comment?
For achieving scale in this particular project, what they did, they also promoted local nurseries. So they actually established some nurseries in the suppose project level. In that way, what they did, they actually reduced the cost of each seedling. So possibly that's one of the approach that we can actually follow. That okay, we want to promote native trees, and let's assume if we want to plant 0.48 million native trees, that's a very big number. So in this particular project, they also brought in a small component for nurseries. So possibly we can also follow that particular approach in future projects.
Maybe if you allow me, I'd like also to point out that the examples of funding mechanisms and funds, global funds we presented today was really for the sake of our discussion today, but it's not exhaustive. So you have multiple other funding schemes, mechanisms, funds out there that could be used to finance synergies between Rio conventions. So it's always a matter when you identify those funds also, if you want to foster those synergies, to enter dialogue with the fund managers and clarify, what could be the entry points for the synergies.
Thank you. Okay, so I see Joseph, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Thanks for the presentations. It's been quite interesting. I wanted to know how is the interface with the incoming developments of countries developing biodiversity plans, financial plans? Because now we are talking at a macro level, the Rio synergies, but when you come now, cascade lower now to project implementation at countries, and when countries now develop these biodiversity financial plans, how is that interface? Will that be another form of complexity in terms of the synergy? Thank you.
That's a very good question. And we partly addressed this aspect in the first webinar, but that's true that the biodiversity finance plans are very specific planning tools to prepare for biodiversity finance at country level. This comes also together with the revision of the NBSAPs to be aligned with the global biodiversity framework. In any case, the biodiversity finance plans are very good entry points, I think, to foster synergies and to make efforts to align those biodiversity finance plans also with the LDN finance strategies at country level, but also with the climate finance strategies at country level. So some of those biodiversity finance plans, I suppose, would have to be, or efforts by those building those plans would have to be made to also integrate the relevant sections, objectives, mechanisms planned already for climate finance, for LDN finance. So not reinvent the wheel, let's say, but rather to consolidate the efforts done already as part of the other finance planning mechanisms.
Thank you very much, Ludwig. So this is a very interesting question and answer session, but due to time constraint, I will move to the last part of our webinar. And I will now give the floor to Pehan for our last interactive session.
Thank you, Stefania, and thank you to Fahim and Ludwig for your wonderful presentations. I feel bad to cut off our heated discussion and bring to everyone a quiz. But please don't panic. This is not a test quiz. It's more like a fun, quick wrap-up quiz that will use the same approach that we just used on for the word cloud. So again, I'm inviting everyone to scan this QR code or go to wooclap.com and enter the code so that you can participate this fun wrap-up quiz. And also, again, you're not doing the quiz by yourself. Everybody can see the results from other people's contributions. So like the last time, I'm going to wait for a while so that you have time to scan the QR code and join in. I'm seeing that already there are 7 people in the WooClap. So I'll wait 1 more minute and let's get started. So I've already switched the screen to the WooClap webpage. For those who haven't yet joined in, please take your time. We'll wait for another 30 seconds and then let's start the quiz together. All right, I see there are already 13 people signed up for the quiz. Then let's get started. Let's start with something rather easy. Which of the following best describes a synergistic project under the Rio Conventions? 1, 2, 3. You can see here that already 3 people have answered this question. And let's give a show of hands of everybody's answers. Yes, everybody is choosing B uniquely, the project that integrates biodiversity, land degradation, and climate change. And the second question, which ones of these following of these global funds that can support synergistic projects across the Rio Conventions? Just a little tip that there can be more than one answers to this question. Oh, good. I see there are a total of 15 people here. And half of them have already answered the question. Aha. I see that everybody is, most people answer to global environment facility, and also many people chose the rest of the 3. Well, actually all of them can support synergistic projects across Rio Conventions. So for the third question, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, is primarily aligned with which of the Rio Conventions? I see you are hesitating now because the answer is, oh no, it's actually popping out soon. So 9 out of 16 people has already made their choice. Let's take a look. All the 3 Rio Conventions equally or the UNFCCC? The answer is the UNFCCC. B is the correct answer. GCF is primarily aligned with this with the Climate Change Convention, although this next question is going to ask you, the GEF provides financing to eligible countries to help them meet the objectives of which Rio Conventions? The answer, UNFCCC, CBD, and UNCCD is the correct one, which also is the most, which also most people choose it. This is not saying that that Jeff is supports all of them, while GCF only aligns to the UNFCCC. It's just that both of them, including the other 2 funds, supports projects that build synergies between the 3 Rio Conventions, while that GCF is primarily aligned to UNFCCC. Now let's move on to the 5th question. How does the GCF promote synergies between the objectives of UNFCCC, CBD, and UNCCD? You can take some time to read all these options. And let's see how everybody chooses their answers. Apparently, nobody is choosing by requiring all funded projects address all 3 conventions, which is not practical, nor did anybody choose exclusively financing climate change adaptation projects, which is opposite to everything we're talking about today. And also, organizing joint conferences for the conventions. Yeah, I know it's kind of an appealing approach, and also I know that some people is calling for this, but I'm afraid that's beyond GCF's capacity or mandate. The correct answer is D, supporting climate action projects, because GCF is primarily aligned with UNFCCC, while generating co-benefits for biodiversity conservation and land degradation. Co-benefits is a word that you're going to hear a lot when talking about synergies. Now, the 6th question, which of the following is an example of a GCF-funded project that promotes synergies between multiple Rio Convention objectives? Again, please take your time to read all these options. Good. I see there's a 17th participant to our quiz. And let's give a showdown. Aha! Everybody is choosing answer A, which is the correct one. So let's move on to the 7th question. Which of the following is a key characteristic of projects funded by the Adaptation Fund? We can see here that most people choose to enhance the resilience to climate change impacts in vulnerable communities and ecosystems, which is the correct answer, because Adaptation Fund primarily supports climate change adaptation efforts, whereas reducing greenhouse gas emissions is more about climate change mitigation. Next question. Which of the following is a key benefit of using domestic funds, such as the Conservation Trust Funds and National Climate Funds, to promote synergies between the Rio Conventions? Okay, 8 out of 18 people have made their choice, and we're seeing 73% of them choose the last one, that domestic funds can provide flexible long-term funding that can be aligned with national priorities, which is the correct one. Whereas the focus on short-term financing to meet immediate environmental needs, I'm afraid, is not the correct answer. Now, the last but one question, which Rio Convention primarily initiated the REDD plus mechanism? The REDD stands for Reduction of Emission from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, and the plus stands for the supportive actions that contributes to protect the climate, such as sustainable forest management. And most of you have chosen the UNFCCC, which is the correct answer, because RE mostly stands for reduction of emissions. But of course, while we are trying to reduce the emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, of course, we are also supporting the objectives of preserving biodiversity and also neutralizing land degradation. Therefore, the REDD plus mechanism also brings co-benefits to the other two Rio Conventions. Now, the last question, the LDN Fund, which stands for the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund, can only deliver land degradation neutrality outcomes. The LDN targets are the primary, one of the primary goals set under the UNCCD. Is this true or false? And everybody is choosing false. You are correct. While supporting the LDN targets, of course, we are bringing co-benefits to reverse climate change and also to protect biodiversity. That'll be all for this fun and wrap-up quiz. Thank you all for your participation. I'm giving the floor back to Stefania. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Behan. And as we close this webinar, I would like to thank our colleague Eri from CBD for his opening remarks, and to Ludwig, Fahim, and Pehan for sharing invaluable insights and experiences. So today's discussion has underscored how you can access and mobilize finance for synergistic projects. I would also like to thank representatives from the three secretariats, that is UNFCCC, CBD, and UNCCD, for their support and collaboration. And thank you, dear participants, for your presence and active participation today. And we look forward to your participation and engagement for our next webinar, which is scheduled for 14th October. And in the third session of the webinar series, we'll focus on enhancing the role of local and indigenous knowledge in supporting synergies. The registration link will be available very soon. Thank you. Nice evening and nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.